The roses were still wet with the morning dew, and the garden smelled like damp earth and something sweeter, something almost forbidden. Charlotte Blake stood only inches from me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her breath in the cool morning air. For weeks I had imagined what it might feel like if she ever looked at me the way I looked at her. But imagining it, and standing there in the quiet light of early morning, were not the same thing. Her hand brushed mine, lightly, almost by accident. Or perhaps not. For a moment neither of us moved. The world beyond those stone walls, Ashcroft Manor, my family, the endless expectations of a daughter of an English Earl. All of it seemed very far away. Charlotte's eyes met mine, and something inside me gave way. Not fear, not hesitation. Something softer, something far more dangerous. I remember thinking, this is the moment everything changes. And then, she kissed me. Soft at first, almost careful, as though we both understood that once that distance disappeared, nothing in our lives could ever return to what it had been. My name is Eleanor Whitmore, daughter of the Earl of Ashcroft, raised to become the perfect wife, and the first person who ever made my heart lose its composure was the woman hired to help me dress. But I suppose I should begin a little earlier, because love like ours did not begin with a kiss. It began with a look, and a quiet garden no one else seemed to remember. I remember the sound the gravel made beneath my shoes that morning, a dry, patient crunch. Ashcroft Manor always sounded like that at dawn, quiet things shifting slowly into place. Servants moving through corridors, doors opening with careful restraint. The distant clatter of porcelain somewhere below the grand staircase. The house woke gently, but I never did. I would lie awake long before the bells rang, staring at the pale canopy above my bed, counting the carved roses along the woodwork as if they might rearrange themselves overnight and spell out some different future. They never did. My name is Eleanor Whitmore, daughter of Edward Whitmore, Earl of Ashcroft. A title that sounds far more glamorous than it ever felt when one was born inside it. People imagine a childhood like mine as something luminous, grand halls, velvet gowns, candlelit dinners where everyone speaks softly and laughs politely. And they are not entirely wrong. Ashcroft Manor was beautiful, painfully so. Tall windows that caught the early sun, endless gardens stretching toward the Hampshire hills, marble fireplaces large enough to warm half the house. Portraits of long-dead Whitmores staring down from the walls as if they were quietly supervising every choice we made. It was a house built on legacy, which meant it was also built on expectation. My elder sister, Catherine, had understood that long before I did. She moved through life the way Mother had always intended, graceful, obedient, perfectly aware of where she belonged in every room. She married the previous autumn, Lord Halbrook. A good match, everyone said. Respectable, stable, convenient. I remember standing beside her in the chapel as the vows were spoken, watching the candlelight flicker against her veil, and wondering whether anyone else noticed how tightly she held her bouquet, as if letting go of it might cause something inside her to unravel. But Catherine never unraveled. She smiled. She said all the right things, and she left Ashcroft Manor exactly as she was meant to. Which meant that when the carriages disappeared down the long drive and the house settled into its new quiet, something shifted in the way people looked at me. Not dramatically, just subtly. A longer glance from my mother at breakfast. A thoughtful pause from my father during dinner conversations. The occasional mention of visitors who might be calling in the coming months. I was 21. The arithmetic of society was simple. Catherine had married, which meant I was next. At first I tried not to think about it. Ashcroft Manor had a way of filling your days with small obligations, music lessons, correspondence, afternoon walks through the gardens with my mother, evenings spent entertaining guests who seemed far more interested in the reputation of our estate than the people who lived inside. They ate. And then there were the men. Young heirs mostly. Second sons. Occasionally a distant cousin of someone respectable enough that an invitation to dinner felt appropriate. They all looked at me the same way. Not unkindly, but carefully. as if they were evaluating a painting they might one day purchase. I learned to smile, to ask polite questions, to laugh softly when they attempted humor that rarely deserved it. And afterward I would retreat to the library or the gardens, or anywhere the house felt large enough to breathe inside again. It wasn't that they were unpleasant men. Most of them were perfectly agreeable, which somehow made the emptiness worse. Because I kept waiting for something to happen. Some sudden moment where the room tilted slightly, where my pulse quickened, where I understood. So this is what everyone has been talking about. But it never came. Weeks passed, then months, and the feeling only grew stronger. A quiet, persistent thought that returned to me in strange moments. At breakfast, while riding through the fields, even while brushing my hair in the mirror before bed. Surely it must feel like something. Love, I mean. Surely it must arrive with more than polite conversation and well-tailored coats. Thought became a habit. Then a question. Then something closer to a quiet frustration I couldn't quite explain to anyone else. Because in every other sense my life was perfectly comfortable. Ashcroft Manor was warm. My family was kind, in their particular restrained way. The world beyond the estate was orderly, predictable, stable. And yet, there were mornings when I would walk through the long corridor outside my room and feel a strange hollowness beneath the beauty of it all, though I had been placed carefully inside a life that belonged to someone else. Not unhappiness exactly. Just absence. The kind of absence one cannot easily describe. I remember one afternoon in particular. Early spring. The gardens had begun to wake again, the air carrying the faint scent of damp earth and new leaves. I had been sitting near the tall windows of the morning room, pretending to read while Mother discussed the latest social invitations with Mrs. Harrow, our housekeeper. Their voices drifted in and out of my attention. Carriages, dinner arrangements, someone's nephew returning from university. And then my mother said something that pulled me back completely. She arrives tomorrow. I looked up. Who does? Mother turned a page in her ledger before answering, as though the matter were already settled beyond discussion. Your companion. The word landed strangely. My companion, yes. Charlotte Blake. A widow, I believe. 27, she comes highly recommended. I set the book down slowly. For what purpose? Mother looked at me then. Really looked at me. Not unkindly, but with the same calm certainty she used when discussing table arrangements or guest lists. My dear, Catherine is married. The responsibilities of the household will increasingly fall to you. It is only sensible that you have someone to assist you. Assist me. The phrase sounded harmless enough, and yet something about it unsettled me. I already manage quite well. I'm sure you do, she said gently. But a young lady approaching marriage should not be left without proper guidance. There it was. Not a threat. Not even pressure. Just the quiet inevitability of the life waiting ahead. Marriage. A husband. A new house that would one day resemble this one in all the same careful ways. I remember nodding politely. Because that was what one did in Ashcroft Manor. You nodded. You smiled. You accepted the shape of the world as it had been handed to you. But that evening, as I walked alone along the eastern gardens, the thought returned again. Stronger this time. Surely it must feel like something. The wind moved through the hedges with a low whisper. The sky had begun to turn the deep violet of approaching dusk. And for a moment I wondered, only briefly, whether the life everyone expected of me would ever truly feel like my own. I did not know then how quickly that quiet question would begin to unravel everything. The next morning, Ashcroft Manor woke earlier than usual. Servants moved briskly through the halls. Fresh flowers appeared in the entrance hall. The household had that faint hum of anticipation reserved for new arrivals. I watched from the upstairs landing as the carriage finally rolled into view along the gravel drive. Dark wheels. Polished wood. A single trunk secured behind it. Nothing remarkable. And yet something about the moment felt strangely significant. The carriage door opened. A woman stepped down. She paused briefly beside the carriage, adjusting her gloves as the morning light caught in her hair. Golden. Not bright exactly. More like the soft warmth of late afternoon sunlight. She wore a simple traveling dress, modest and neatly tailored, and a small hat pinned carefully in place. There was nothing extravagant about her appearance, which somehow made her presence stand out more. She carried herself with a quiet steadiness that did not belong to someone merely arriving to serve. Mrs. Harrow moved forward to greet her. They exchanged a few polite words I couldn't hear from above. Then the woman lifted her gaze. Just for a moment. And her eyes found me. Not deliberately. Not in any way that might appear improper. Simply a brief glance toward the upper landing where I stood half hidden behind the carved banister. But the look lingered, half a heartbeat longer than I expected. Long enough that something unfamiliar moved quietly through my chest. Not quite surprise. Not quite curiosity. Just awareness. As though the room had shifted slightly around us. I remember straightening without meaning to. And then the moment passed. Mrs. Kai. Harrow guided her toward the entrance hall. The front doors opened, and Charlotte Blake stepped into Ashcroft Manor for the first time. I did not yet understand why that moment would remain with me, why the sound of her name, spoken later that morning in the drawing room, would settle somewhere beneath my thoughts and refuse to leave, or why, as the day unfolded and introductions were made and polite conversation drifted through the familiar rooms of the house, I found myself noticing small things I had never cared about before. The way she moved through a doorway, the quiet confidence in her voice when she spoke, the faint trace of something warm, almost sweet, in the air after she passed. It was nothing. Or at least that is what I told myself. But later that evening, while brushing my hair before the mirror, the question returned once more. Only this time it felt different. Less distant. More immediate. Surely it must feel like something. And for the first time in my life, I wondered whether that feeling might already be beginning. The first morning after Charlotte Blake arrived, Ashcroft Manor felt slightly different. Not visibly. The same sunlight stretched across the marble floors of the entrance hall. The same portraits watched from the walls with their quiet judgment. The servants moved through the corridors with their usual careful efficiency. And yet something in the rhythm of the house had shifted. Perhaps it was only my imagination. Or perhaps it was the simple fact that I now knew there was someone new inside those walls. Someone whose presence I could not yet quite measure. I did not see her again until breakfast. Mother insisted we receive her properly, which meant the formal dining room rather than the smaller morning room I usually preferred. The table was already set when I arrived, white linen, polished silver. The faint smell of fresh bread drifting from the sideboard. Father sat at the head of the table reading correspondence. Mother reviewed invitations beside him. Charlotte stood near the window. She was not seated yet. For a moment, I wondered if she was uncertain of her place, but the moment I entered she turned toward me with the same composed calm I had noticed the day before. "Good morning, Lady Eleanor." Her voice was lower than I expected. Soft, but steady. The kind of voice that carried easily across a room without needing to rise. "Good morning, Mrs. Blake." The title felt strangely formal on my tongue. She inclined her head politely. "Charlotte will be perfectly acceptable when we are not in company, if you prefer." The suggestion was gentle, but it carried an ease that unsettled me slightly. People did not usually speak to me that way. Most were careful, respectful, measured. Charlotte Blake simply sounded comfortable. Mother gestured for her to sit. Conversation during breakfast remained polite and practical. Mother asked about Charlotte's journey from Bath. Father inquired about her previous household. Charlotte answered calmly, never offering more information than the question required. But I found myself watching her when she wasn't looking. The way she folded her hands when listening. The way she paused a fraction of a second before answering, as though she considered her words carefully rather than rehearsing them. At one point she reached for the teapot. Our hands brushed. It was the briefest contact imaginable. Skin against skin for no more than a heartbeat. And yet something inside my chest reacted immediately. A small, sudden shift in breath. Charlotte withdrew her hand at once. "Forgive me. There's nothing to forgive," I said quickly. The words came out sharper than I intended. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then the conversation resumed around us, the quiet machinery of breakfast continuing as though nothing unusual had happened. But I felt strangely aware of my hands for the rest of the meal, as though the place where she had touched me had not quite settled back into normal. After breakfast, Mother dismissed Charlotte to review the day's arrangements. "She will assist you with correspondence this morning," Mother said to me. "And later perhaps you might walk the Eastern Gardens together." Walk together? The suggestion seemed ordinary enough. Yet the thought of spending several uninterrupted hours with Charlotte Blake stirred a faint tension beneath my calm. Not unpleasant, just unfamiliar. My writing desk overlooked the southern lawn, where the hedges stretched in neat geometric patterns toward the distant tree line. I usually enjoyed the quiet routine of answering letters, but that morning I found myself distracted by the soft sound of Charlotte moving about the room. She organized papers with quiet efficiency, sorted invitations, prepared ink and sealing wax. Occasionally she would pause to ask a brief question. "Shall we decline this invitation from the Marchioness, or postpone?" "Postpone," I said. "And the charity committee?" I hesitated. Charlotte glanced toward me. Her eyes were a pale gray, almost silver in the morning light. Unexpectedly observant. "You do not enjoy those meetings," she said. It wasn't a question. I set my pen down slowly. "How can you possibly know that?" She gave a faint smile. "You read the letters very quickly, and that indicates displeasure? Either displeasure or boredom." The observation was so precise that I felt a brief flush rise along my neck. Perhaps both. Charlotte nodded thoughtfully and made a small note beside the letter. The exchange lasted no more than a minute, and yet the room felt subtly different afterward. More attentive, as though something had quietly shifted between us. The morning passed in that strange, careful rhythm. Small questions, small answers. The occasional brush of sleeves as we reached for the same document. Nothing improper, nothing anyone else would notice. But every so often I would become aware of the faint scent that followed Charlotte wherever she moved. Something warm. Sweet, but not overly so. The sort of fragrance that lingered in the air just long enough to be remembered. By midday, the correspondence was finished. Charlotte closed the final envelope and looked toward the garden doors. "The weather is quite pleasant today." "Yes," I said. "The Eastern Gardens are beautiful in early spring." I knew that. I had walked them countless times, and yet the thought of walking there now felt strangely new. We stepped outside together. The gravel path curved gently through the hedges, opening gradually into wider lawns and scattered clusters of early roses just beginning to bloom. The air carried the damp freshness of recent rain. For several minutes we walked in silence. Not uncomfortable silence. Just quiet. The kind that settles naturally when two people have not yet decided what they are to each other. Charlotte walked with her hands loosely clasped behind her back. Her posture was relaxed, but not careless. Every movement seemed deliberate without appearing rehearsed. "You've lived here your entire life," she said after a while. "Yes. It must feel very familiar." I considered that. "It does. And yet?" The question caught me off guard. "And yet what?" She looked toward the far hills. "Familiar places can sometimes feel smaller than they appear." I slowed slightly. "That's a curious observation." "Not necessarily." Her tone remained thoughtful rather than challenging. "I lived in the same house for nearly 7 years after my marriage," she said quietly. And eventually I realized I could walk through every room without truly seeing any of them. Something about the way she said it made the words linger. Not bitter. Not sad. Simply honest. We continued along the path until the hedges gave way to a small clearing. A stone bench sat beneath a cluster of climbing roses. I had passed that bench countless times before. But standing there beside Charlotte, the moment felt unexpectedly vivid. The breeze moved lightly through the branches above us. Charlotte rested her hand briefly against the back of the bench. "May I ask you something, Lady Eleanor?" The question carried an unusual seriousness. "Yes. Are you happy here?" The words landed with surprising weight. For a moment I almost laughed. Not because the question was amusing, because it felt dangerously close to something I had not yet fully admitted to myself. "I have every reason to be," I said finally. Charlotte watched me carefully. "That is not quite the same thing." A strange warmth moved through my chest. Not anger, something closer to recognition. "You speak very freely for someone who arrived yesterday, perhaps." And yet you answered. She wasn't wrong. I had. For several seconds neither of us spoke. The breeze shifted again. A single rose petal fell between us. And for the first time since Charlotte Blake arrived at Ashcroft Manor, I felt a small, unmistakable awareness settle beneath my thoughts. Not admiration. Not curiosity. Something more unsettling than either. A quiet realization that being near her felt different. Different from the polite conversations I had endured for years. Different from the careful attention of visiting gentlemen. With Charlotte, the silence itself seemed charged with possibility. I looked away first. Not because I wanted to. Because something about the way she was looking at me made my pulse slightly unsteady. We resumed walking. The house appeared again through the trees as we approached the main lawn. Servants moved across the terrace preparing for afternoon tea. Life continued. Exactly as it always had. And yet as we stepped back onto the gravel path leading toward the house, the thought returned again. The same one that had followed me for months. Only now it felt sharper. More immediate. Surely it must feel like something. But this time the question carried a second, quieter possibility. Not whether such a feeling existed, but whether, without fully understanding how, I had just begun to feel it. And whether Charlotte Blake had noticed the moment it began. I began noticing Charlotte Blake in moments that had nothing to do with conversation. Which, I suppose, was the first warning. The world inside Ashcroft Manor had always followed a dependable rhythm. Mornings were for correspondence. Afternoons for walking the gardens or receiving callers. Evenings for dinner, music, and whatever polite social rituals the season demanded. It was a life arranged like a well-composed painting. Balanced. Predictable. And for most of my life, I had moved through it without questioning the composition. But once Charlotte arrived, the painting began to feel unsettled. Not dramatically. Just small disturbances. Moments that caught my attention when they should not have. The sound of her footsteps behind me in the corridor. The faint warmth of her presence when she leaned slightly closer to review a letter at my desk. The way she occasionally paused before speaking, as if weighing whether a thought deserved to exist aloud. None of these things should have mattered. And yet they did. I first noticed the change one evening, while she was helping me dress for dinner. Mother had invited several guests that night, friends of my father, the wife of a local magistrate, and the nephew of a baronet whose name I had already forgotten. Charlotte stood behind me, fastening the narrow row of buttons along the back of my gown. It was a pale blue silk dress Catherine had left behind before her marriage. The fabric was light against my skin, and the evening air drifting through the window carried the cool scent of damp roses from the garden. Charlotte worked carefully, her fingers moving one button at a time. Neither of us spoke. The quiet should have been ordinary. Instead, my awareness sharpened. I could hear the soft rustle of fabric, the faint brush of her sleeve against my shoulder, the sound of my own breathing, and then her fingers touched the back of my neck. Not accidentally, just long enough to steady the final button. But the moment her skin brushed mine, something inside my body reacted before my thoughts could follow. A sudden warmth. A sharp, quiet pull somewhere beneath my ribs. My breath caught. Charlotte noticed immediately. Her hands stilled. "Are you uncomfortable?" The question was calm. Too calm. "No." The word came out softer than I intended. For a moment neither of us moved. Her hand remained near my collar. I could feel the warmth of it without seeing it. And in that suspended moment, a strange thought crossed my mind. Clearer than anything I had allowed myself to consider before. I was not uncomfortable. Not at all. If anything, I was suddenly far too aware of the space between us. Charlotte stepped back then, smoothing the fabric gently along my shoulders. "You're ready." I turned toward the mirror. My reflection looked exactly the same. The same pale blue dress. The same carefully arranged hair. The same young woman everyone in Hampshire expected me to be. But my pulse had not quite settled. Dinner that evening passed, as dinners always did. Conversation drifted politely across the table. My father discussed the condition of the southern fields. Mother asked careful questions about local engagements and upcoming events. The baronet's nephew, whose name I finally learned was Thomas, attempted several times to engage me in conversation about hunting. I answered politely. smiled when appropriate. But my attention wandered, because Charlotte was seated across the room beside Mrs. Harrow, assisting with the household arrangements for the following week. Every so often I felt her gaze pass briefly over the table. Not lingering, not improper, just attentive. And each time it happened, something tightened quietly in my chest. It was ridiculous. Charlotte Blake was my companion. A widow. 7 years older than I was. Our positions in the household were perfectly clear. And yet the thought returned again. Uninvited. Persistent. Surely it must feel like something. But now the thought had begun to change. It was no longer a vague question about the nature of love. Now it had shape. A direction. And that direction unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Later that week we began walking the western grounds together. Those gardens were less formal than the eastern paths my mother preferred. The hedges grew taller there, the paths narrower, the air quieter. Charlotte seemed to like that part of the estate. Or perhaps I simply noticed her more there. We spoke easily when we walked. Not about society. Not about marriage. About smaller things. Books. Travel. Occasionally her life in Bath before arriving at Ashcroft. One afternoon the sky threatened rain and the gardens were almost entirely empty. The gravel path curved through a cluster of tall hedges, before opening briefly toward a stretch of old stone walls that marked the far edge of the estate. Charlotte slowed as we reached the wall. "There is something here, isn't there?" I followed her gaze. Hidden beneath a curtain of ivy was a narrow iron gate. I had almost forgotten it existed. "My grandfather's garden," I said. Charlotte turned toward me. "You sound as though it has been abandoned." "In many ways it has." The gate creaked softly as I pushed it open. Inside, the garden felt different from the rest of the estate. Wilder. The roses climbed freely along the old stone walls. The fountain in the center had long since gone silent, its basin filled with fallen petals and rainwater. But the place was beautiful. In a way Ashcroft Manor itself rarely allowed. Charlotte stepped slowly along the path. Her hand brushed lightly across the stone edge of the fountain. "It's peaceful, yes. Why does no one come here?" "My grandfather painted here," I said. "After he died, the garden simply became forgotten." Charlotte looked around again, her expression thoughtful. "Forgotten places often keep the most honest secrets." The remark lingered between us. I wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was the quiet of the garden, or the way the late afternoon light filtered through the climbing roses, casting soft shadows across the path. But suddenly I felt very aware of how alone we were. Charlotte moved toward the old stone bench near the wall. She turned as I approached. For a moment we simply stood there. Close. Closer than we usually stood when speaking. The air smelled faintly of rain. I could hear the slow rhythm of my own breathing. And then Charlotte said something very quietly. "May I tell you something honest, Eleanor?" She had never used my name before. Not without the title. The sound of it in her voice sent a small, unexpected tremor through my chest. "Yes," I said. She studied my face for a long moment. "I think you've spent most of your life being careful." The observation struck me more deeply than it should have. "Careful? Yes." Her voice remained gentle. "As though every choice has already been decided for you." My pulse quickened slightly. "That is simply the way things are, perhaps." She held my gaze. "But sometimes the way things are isn't the same as the way things should be." The silence that followed felt heavier than the words themselves. My body reacted before my mind could follow. A strange warmth spread through my chest. Not fear. Something more dangerous. Desire. The realization arrived so suddenly that it left me momentarily unsteady. I had never looked at another woman this way before. Never felt this quiet pull towards someone standing so close. The world beyond the garden suddenly felt very real again. My father. My mother. The endless expectations that shaped my life. And here I stood in a forgotten garden with the woman hired to guide me toward marriage. A dangerous thought slipped into my mind before I could stop it. What am I becoming? Charlotte's hand moved slightly on the stone bench beside her. Not touching me. Not yet. But close enough that the distance between us felt fragile. The moment stretched. Neither of us spoke. And for the first time since Charlotte Blake entered Ashcroft Manor, I understood something about myself that I could no longer pretend not to see. Whatever this feeling was, it had already begun to change me. The first time Charlotte Blake kissed me, the world did not end. Which, in a strange way, made everything far more dangerous. Because for several days after that afternoon in the forgotten garden, nothing visibly changed. Ashcroft Manor continued exactly as it always had. Breakfast conversations drifted calmly across the long table. My father spoke of estate matters. My mother discussed the approaching social season with careful enthusiasm. Letters arrived. Invitations were accepted or declined. Servants moved quietly through the halls with trays and folded linens. The house remained perfectly composed. And yet beneath that calm surface something had begun to shift. Inside me. It was not the kiss itself, not exactly. Because the kiss had been brief. Soft. So tentative that if someone had passed by the garden gate at that exact moment, they might not even have recognized what they were seeing. Charlotte had been standing very close to me beside the stone bench. Close enough that I could see the faint gold threads in her hair where the late afternoon light touched it. I remember the scent of roses in the air, the quiet hum of insects moving lazily between the flowers, and the strange stillness that settled over both of us when our conversation simply stopped. Charlotte had looked at me differently then. Not as a companion, not as a servant observing her employer, but as a woman seeing another woman clearly for the first time. Her hand moved slowly, not toward my face, just toward my wrist. Her fingers barely touched the inside of my arm, but the contact sent a sharp awareness through my entire body. I should have stepped back. Every lesson I had ever learned about propriety demanded it. Instead, I stayed exactly where I was. My body reacted before my mind could assemble the appropriate resistance. My breath slowed. My pulse quickened. And when Charlotte finally leaned closer, the movement felt almost inevitable. The kiss had been quiet. No urgency. No force. Just the soft meeting of two people who both understood that crossing that small distance would change everything that followed. When it ended, neither of us spoke. Charlotte stepped back first. Her expression was calm, but her breathing was not quite steady. "Forgive me," she said quietly. The words were almost instinctive. A reflex from a world that required apologies for moments like that. But something inside me resisted the idea immediately. There is nothing to forgive. The truth of that answer frightened me, because I realized, in that exact moment, that I did not regret what had just happened. Not even slightly. That was the fracture. The quiet internal break that I could no longer pretend did not exist. After that afternoon, the garden became something else entirely. Not simply a forgotten corner of the estate. A place. A possibility. Charlotte and I did not speak about the kiss again that day, or the next. But our awareness of each other sharpened. Small things changed. The distance between us when we stood together in a room. The way our eyes met for slightly longer than necessary. The occasional pause in conversation when the air between us seemed suddenly full of unspoken thought. At night, alone in my room, I found myself remembering the exact warmth of her hand against my wrist. The quiet way she had said my name. And every time the memory returned, the same thought followed closely behind it. Surely it must feel like something. Now I knew the answer. It did. Far more than I had ever expected. And that realization carried its own quiet danger. Because the world outside the garden had not changed at all. My parents still spoke casually about potential suitors. Visitors continued to arrive at Ashcroft Manor with polite smiles and well-practiced compliments. The life that had been planned for me remained firmly in place, which meant that whatever was growing between Charlotte and me existed entirely outside the boundaries of that life. And yet, despite knowing that, neither of us stepped away. If anything, we moved closer. It happened gradually. A conversation that lasted a little longer in the library after dinner. An afternoon walk that wandered farther than usual into the western gardens. A moment of shared laughter over some small absurdity in one of my father's letters. None of these things would have appeared unusual to anyone watching, but they felt different to me. Charged. One evening, nearly a week after the first kiss, the rain began just after sunset. Not a storm, just a steady, quiet rainfall that softened the sounds of the house and filled the air with the scent of wet earth. Most of the household had retired early. I was sitting in a small music room near the back of the manor, idly touching the piano keys without really playing. The room was dimly lit. The rain tapped gently against the tall windows, and for several minutes I allowed myself to sit in that quiet without thinking about anything at all, until the door opened softly behind me. I knew it was Charlotte before I turned around. Perhaps it was the sound of her footsteps, or perhaps I had simply begun to recognize her presence instinctively. She paused near the doorway. I didn't realize the room was occupied. "You may stay," I said. She hesitated only briefly before stepping inside. The fire in the corner cast a warm light across the room. Charlotte moved slowly toward the piano. "You played beautifully. I was barely playing, even so." Her voice carried the same calm warmth I had come to recognize. But tonight something in the atmosphere felt slightly different. Perhaps it was the rain, or perhaps it was the quiet awareness that we were completely alone in this part of the house. Charlotte stopped beside the piano. Close. Not touching, but close enough that I could feel the faint warmth of her presence again. Neither of us spoke for a moment. The silence stretched gently between us. And then Charlotte said something so softly, I almost thought I had imagined it. "You've been avoiding the garden." The observation startled me. "I have not since Tuesday." Her attention to detail unsettled me slightly. "I thought perhaps you wished to forget what happened there." Charlotte looked at me carefully. "Do you?" The question lingered in the air. My body reacted before I could assemble a careful answer. The truth rose too quickly. "No." The word felt like stepping across an invisible line. Charlotte's expression softened. She reached toward the piano. Her hand rested lightly beside mine on the polished wood, not touching, but the distance between our fingers was suddenly very small. The rain outside grew heavier. The house seemed to hold its breath. And then Charlotte turned toward me fully. Her eyes searched my face, not urgently, not demanding, but with a quiet question I could feel without hearing it spoken. I did not move away. Not when her hand finally covered mine. Not when she stepped closer. The moment felt both frightening and inevitable. A quiet recognition passing between us that whatever restraint had existed before was slowly dissolving. Charlotte lifted her other hand gently to my cheek. Her fingers were warm, steady. My breath caught again, exactly the way it had in the garden. But this time neither of us apologized. The kiss that followed was deeper than the first. Still careful. Still tender. But no longer uncertain. Time seemed to shift around us. The rain softened the sounds of the house. The fire burned lower. And the distance between us, physical, emotional, every kind of distance, simply disappeared. What followed unfolded quietly. Not rushed. Not reckless. Just two people who had finally stopped pretending they did not feel what had already begun to grow between them. The world outside the room continued as it always had. But inside that small space something irreversible happened. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just a quiet surrender to the truth we had both been circling for days. Later, much later, I remember the room being almost completely dark. The rain had slowed. The fire had faded to glowing embers. Charlotte lay beside me on the small chaise near the window, her head resting lightly against my shoulder. Our breathing slowly returned to its natural rhythm. Neither of us spoke for a long time, because words suddenly felt unnecessary. But beneath that calm silence, another realization slowly took shape inside me. Whatever had begun between us now carried weight. Risk. Consequences neither of us had yet fully named. Ashcroft Manor still stood exactly as it had before. My family still believed my future was already decided. And somewhere beyond these quiet walls, the world remained entirely unaware of the fragile secret now growing inside it. Charlotte's fingers moved slowly across my hand. A simple gesture. But it carried a quiet promise that unsettled me more than anything else. Because for the first time since she arrived, I understood how much I might lose. And how little I wanted to step back. The next morning, I woke before the house did. For a few suspended seconds I did not know why my body felt different. Then memory returned, not all at once, but in fragments. The quiet rain against the windows. the warmth of Charlotte's hand covering mine beside the piano, the fire sinking lower as the room darkened around us. The moment the last hesitation between us disappeared and neither of us stepped back, I opened my eyes slowly. The canopy above my bed was pale in the soft gray light of dawn, the embroidered roses along its edge just visible in the half-dark. Ashcroft Manor had not changed. My room remained exactly as it had always been. The carved wardrobe stood near the far wall. The dressing table faced the window. My slippers waited where they had been placed the night before. Everything around me looked untouched. But I was not untouched. That realization arrived quietly. Not with shame. Not even with fear, not yet. Something gentler than that. A stillness that seemed to spread through me from the inside, as if some locked door in my chest had finally opened and left the air inside altered forever. I lay there listening to the distant silence of the house. Somewhere below, a servant crossed a corridor. A door closed softly. The day was beginning the way all days at Ashcroft Manor began. And still I did not move. Because if I moved, I would have to step back into the life that existed outside that room with the rain-dark windows and the dying fire. I turned my face slightly toward the pale morning light and closed my eyes again. The memory of Charlotte came back more fully then. Not only the tenderness of her mouth against mine, not only the feel of her breath near my cheek in the darkness, but the quiet after. The way we had lain there without speaking, as though words might have made something sacred feel smaller than it was. The world outside had fallen away so completely in those hours that for a little while I had forgotten who I was supposed to be. Not Lady Eleanor Whitmore, not the daughter of an English Earl, not the young woman whose future was being measured in suitable visits, family expectations, and whispered conversations behind drawing-room doors. Only myself. Only a woman who had wanted, and been wanted in return. That made my pulse stir. I pressed the back of my hand lightly to my lips and stared at the ceiling again. Surely it must feel like something. It did. More than something. Enough to undo a life if it had to. That was the part I still could not look at directly. A knock came softly at my door. Not Charlotte. Too measured. Too practical. "Come in," I said. It was Mary, one of the maids, carrying hot water in the calm expression of someone who had no idea the world had shifted while she slept. "Good morning, my lady. Good morning." She set the basin down and began her usual small tasks, drawing back the curtains, laying out my gown, moving through the room with practiced discretion. I watched the light spread gradually across the floorboards. The house was fully awake now. There would be breakfast. Conversation. The ordinary choreography of the day. And somewhere inside that carefully arranged world, Charlotte would be moving through it too. That sent a strange unease through me. Not because I regretted anything. Because I did not know how to see her now. Or rather, I did know. And that was the danger. I dressed more slowly than usual. When I finally stepped into the corridor, the air felt cooler than I expected. Morning light fell in long pale bands across the carpet. Somewhere nearby I heard the faint clink of china from below. At the top of the staircase I saw Charlotte. She was standing near the tall landing window, speaking quietly with Mrs. Harrow about the day's arrangements. Her posture was composed, her expression calm. Nothing about her appearance suggested that she had held me in the darkness only hours before. And yet I knew. I knew the shape of her silence now, the warmth of her nearness, the way her breathing changed when she was no longer pretending not to feel anything. She glanced up. Our eyes met, only for a moment. No one else in the corridor would have noticed anything unusual. No servant pausing below. No passing maid with folded linens. It was only a glance. And still my breath caught so sharply that I had to steady my hand against the banister. Charlotte's face did not visibly change, but something in her gaze softened. Not enough to betray us. Just enough to remind me that the previous night had not been a dream conjured by loneliness and rain. Mrs. Harrow continued speaking. Charlotte answered her calmly. I descended the staircase as though my heartbeat had not betrayed me entirely. At breakfast, my mother discussed a letter from my sister Catherine regarding her new home in Sussex. Father made a dry remark about local politics. I answered when spoken to. Passed the tea. Buttered my toast. I did everything I had always done, but the room seemed full of invisible edges. Charlotte stood near the sideboard for part of the meal, helping oversee the service. Once, when I looked up too quickly, I found her watching me. Not openly, not boldly, but with a kind of careful steadiness that seemed to reach me across the length of the table and settle beneath my skin. I looked away at once, then hated myself for doing so, because the truth was unbearable in its simplicity. I wanted to go to her. Even here. Even now. Especially now that I knew what it was to be close to her with no more distance left between us. I pressed my fingers lightly around the handle of my teacup until the porcelain warmed in my hand. Mother asked whether I intended to ride that afternoon. Perhaps later, I said. Charlotte's gaze did not shift, but I felt her attention sharpen. Later. The word hung between us like an unspoken arrangement. The morning passed in a blur of little duties. Letters to answer. Fabric samples to review with my mother for a dinner she was planning the following week. A discussion about household visiting calls that felt so tedious, so absurdly small, that I found myself struggling to remain present. At one point my mother lifted a length of pale blue ribbon and said, "This would suit you well, Eleanor. It makes you look softer." Softer. I almost laughed. Not because the remark was cruel. It was not. But because she had no idea how little I resembled the daughter she believed she understood. I thought of Charlotte's hands. Of the silence between us the night before. Of the way I had surrendered without wanting to resist. And suddenly the ribbon in my mother's hand looked like part of a costume made for someone else. When I finally found a reason to leave the room, I went first to the library, then the west corridor, then nowhere at all. I simply walked because I could not bear sitting still, while the whole of my body seemed tuned to one presence in the house. By the time the afternoon light had softened, I knew exactly where I wanted to go. The garden. Not the formal eastern paths. Not the broad lawns visible from the terrace. The forgotten place beyond the ivy-covered gate where silence itself seemed to belong to us. I reached it first. The old iron latch gave with a familiar creak. Inside, the garden was quieter than the rest of the estate, as though the stone walls kept not only secrets but sound. The fountain remained dry, its basin holding scattered petals and rainwater from the night before. Damp roses climbed the walls in tangled abundance. The air still carried the sweet, wet perfume of the previous evening's rain. I stood beside the stone bench and tried to steady myself. A ridiculous effort. The moment I heard the gate open behind me, every careful thought scattered. Charlotte stepped inside and closed it gently. For a second, neither of us moved. Then she said, very softly, "I was afraid you might avoid me again." The truth rose before caution could soften it. I wanted to. A faint shift in her expression, something between understanding and pain. "But you came." "Yes." The single word felt rawer than I intended. Charlotte took a few slow steps toward me. The gravel gave softly beneath her shoes. A breeze moved through the climbing roses and stirred the loose tendrils of ivy along the wall. "I did not wish to presume anything about last night," she said, "or make it more difficult for you than it already is." I looked at her then, really looked. At the quiet care in her face. The restraint she was still trying to offer me even after all that had passed between us. And something inside me tightened. Not from fear. From tenderness. "I do not find you difficult," I said. The words came out almost as a whisper. Charlotte's mouth parted slightly, then closed again. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of all the things we still did not know how to say. I moved toward the bench, more to give my body something to do than from any real intention to sit. Charlotte came with me, close enough now that I could smell that faint sweetness again beneath the cool garden air. We sat side by side, not touching at first. The old stone was still damp with the remnants of rain. For a long while we said nothing. The world beyond the walls continued without us. Somewhere in the distance, too faint to locate precisely, a stable hand called to another. A door shut somewhere nearer the manor. The late afternoon carried on. Servants would be preparing lamps. My mother would be making notes about the evening meal. My father would be in his study. The outside world kept moving. And still we remained there in the pause between what had happened and what must eventually come after it. At last Charlotte spoke. "Do you regret it?" She did not have to say what she meant. I stared ahead at the ruined fountain, at the rainwater holding a blurred reflection of the pale sky. "No." The answer came more steadily this time. No, I repeated, quieter. That is what frightens me. Charlotte turned toward me, and I felt the movement before I looked at her. Eleanor, I should regret it, I said, cutting gently across the beginning of my name. That would be simpler, safer, it would make sense of the world again. I swallowed. But I don't. My hands were clasped too tightly in my lap. Charlotte noticed. Of course she did. She reached over and, very slowly, eased one of my hands free. Her fingers threaded through mine, with such careful tenderness that my chest ached from it. You needn't say what you are not ready to say, she murmured. But that was the thing. Something in me had grown tired of silence. Not the beautiful silence between us when no words were needed. The other kind. The silence I had been taught all my life. The kind that kept things proper and hidden and obediently unnamed. I turned toward her fully. When you touched me last night, I said, my voice lower than I meant it to be, I felt... The sentence broke apart. I let out a breath and tried again. I felt more myself than I have in years. Charlotte's hand tightened around mine. The look in her eyes changed then. Not with surprise exactly. More like grief and desire meeting in the same place. As though she knew the cost of hearing those words. As though she understood what it meant that I had spoken them aloud. I had expected relief after saying it. What I felt instead was exposure. A strange, trembling sense that I had opened some hidden part of myself and placed it between us where it could no longer be denied. Charlotte lifted our joined hands slightly, just enough for her thumb to brush once across my knuckles. Eleanor, she said softly, there are some truths that change the shape of a life once they are spoken. I know, do you? The question was gentle, not dismissive. And still, it struck somewhere deep. Because the truth was that I did not know, not fully. Not in the practical worldly ways Charlotte likely did. I knew only what I felt. The force of it. The impossible rightness of her nearness. The unbearable wrongness of imagining stepping back now. I know enough, I whispered. Her eyes searched my face for a long moment. Then she said the thing I had not wanted her to say. You are the daughter of an earl. I looked away first. The old ache was immediate. Yes, you live in a world that has already written your future in ink. Something sharp passed through me. And you think I do not know that? I think you know it, she said. I do not think you have yet had to feel how heavy it is. The garden seemed suddenly smaller. The walls closer. The air thicker. Because beneath her calm words was the first true pressure of reality since the night before. Not a fading of what we had done. Not regret. Something worse. Perspective. Charlotte had lived in the real world in ways I had not. Marriage. Widowhood. Dependence. Loss. She knew what consequences looked like when they stopped being abstract fears and became the shape of one's daily life. I drew my hand from hers then, not in anger, but because the tenderness of the moment had become almost painful. If you are trying to make me afraid, I said, it is too late. Charlotte's expression shifted at once. That was not my intention. Then what is? She stood and moved a few steps away, as though she needed space to speak honestly. My intention, she said after a moment, is not to be careless with you. The words landed harder than any raised voice might have. Because suddenly I understood. Charlotte was not stepping back from desire. She was afraid of what my desire might cost me. That knowledge should have soothed me. Instead, it made everything feel more precarious. I rose too. The space between us was no more than a few feet now, and still it felt too wide. I am not asking you to be careless. No, she said. You are asking me not to leave you alone inside this. The truth of that stole the next breath from me. I had not known until that instant that it was exactly what I was asking. Not with words. With my body. With my presence here. With the fact that after a night that should have filled me with terror, what I wanted most was to be near her again. Charlotte took one small step closer. Her voice softened. And I do not wish to leave you alone in it. The fragility of that confession undid me more thoroughly than anything else could have. Because it was not a promise. Not a fantasy. Not a vow stolen from a novel. It was simpler. And therefore more dangerous. She cared. Enough to fear this properly. Enough to stay despite the fear. I could feel my pulse everywhere. In my throat, my wrists, the space beneath my ribs. Then don't, I said. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly. Only a second. But when she opened them again, something restrained in her had changed. She crossed the remaining distance between us and touched my face with both hands, not hurriedly, not with reckless hunger, but with the kind of reverence that makes surrender feel less like falling and more like being seen completely. I leaned into her without meaning to. No, without wanting not to. Her forehead rested lightly against mine. The garden around us softened into scent and silence and light. "Do you understand," she whispered, "that every time you come to me like this, it will become harder to imagine living without it?" The words should have frightened me. They did, but not enough. "Then perhaps," I said, my breath unsteady, "we should stop imagining that we can." For one suspended moment neither of us moved. Then Charlotte kissed me. Not with the uncertainty of the first time, not with the trembling discovery of the second. This kiss carried knowledge now. Memory. The quiet ache of restraint already tested and found too fragile to hold us apart. My hands rose instinctively to her waist. Her fingers slid into my hair. The roses along the wall stirred in the breeze, releasing more sweetness into the damp air. When the kiss broke, we stayed close, breathing the same breath. I had no sense of time. Only the feel of her heartbeat where our bodies nearly met. Only the unbearable truth that the garden no longer belonged to my grandfather's silence. It belonged to us now. Or rather, to what happened to us there. We sat again after that, though not as we had before. Charlotte's shoulder against mine, my hand resting open over hers on the bench between us. The shadows had lengthened. Evening was slowly approaching. It should have felt peaceful. In some ways, it did. But the calm was thinner now. More fragile. The kind that forms when two people know they have crossed into something beautiful and have just begun to understand how breakable it might be. "Mother mentioned visitors this morning," I said quietly after a long silence. Charlotte did not move, but I felt her attention sharpen. "What sort of visitors?" "I don't know yet." I stared at the darkening fountain. The kind that always arrive when a family begins to think time is moving too quickly. Charlotte was silent for so long that I finally turned to look at her. Her profile had gone still. The softness of moments before remained, but it was now joined by something else. A knowledge of where stories like ours were usually broken. I knew it too. Or I was beginning to. The world had tolerated my girlhood because girlhood is allowed its little wildness before it is folded neatly into marriage. But there would come a point when they would no longer see me as unfinished. They would begin to finish me for themselves. I thought of my mother's careful voice, of my father's practical calm, of the endless machinery of reputation and alliance that moved so politely through houses like this one. And for the first time since the night of rain, fear rose clearly enough to name. Not fear of what I felt. Fear of losing the place where I had become most myself. Charlotte turned her hand beneath mine and laced our fingers together once more. Neither of us spoke after that. We remained on the stone bench until the light thinned and the garden darkened around us. The first evening chill crept in through the walls. Somewhere beyond the ivy-covered gate, the manor lamps would soon be lit, one by one. At last Charlotte stood. "We should go back." Yes, I thought. We should. But neither of us moved at once. When we finally walked toward the gate, the path seemed shorter than before. Too short. At the entrance, Charlotte paused and looked at me with an expression I knew I would remember long after the details of that evening blurred. Not sorrow. Not hope. Something more exacting than either. The look of a woman already measuring how much can be carried before the world notices the weight. I did not yet know whose name would soon be spoken in my mother's drawing room. I did not yet know the color of his hair, or the shape of his voice, or the quiet place he would come to occupy in the story of my undoing. I knew only this, that as Charlotte opened the gate, and the first lamps of Ashcroft Manor began to glow across the darkening lawn, the life waiting beyond those walls felt closer than ever, and far less bearable than it had the day before. The morning the letter arrived, the air at Ashcroft Manor felt strangely bright. Not warm. Spring in Hampshire was rarely generous that early in the season, but clear. The sort of pale sunlight that reveals every detail of a place you thought you already understood. I noticed it while standing at the long windows in the morning room. The lawn stretched wide beyond the glass, still wet from the night's dew. Servants moved quietly along the gravel paths. Somewhere near the stables a horse stamped once, impatient with the slow beginning of the day. For a moment nothing felt different. Which should have warned me. Charlotte entered the room not long after. She carried the quiet composure she always did, a small stack of correspondence in her hands. Her hair had been pinned with particular care that morning, though I doubted anyone else in the house would notice such a detail. But I noticed everything about her now. The way she paused just inside the doorway when she saw me. The faint change in her breathing. The way her eyes softened, only slightly, before the careful discipline returned. "Good morning, Eleanor." The sound of my name in her voice had changed since the night of rain. Not louder, not bolder, just closer. "Good morning." She placed the letters on the small writing desk near the window. "I thought you might wish to review these before breakfast." I stepped beside her. Our shoulders nearly touched. The smallest distance between us felt louder than conversation. Charlotte lifted the top envelope. "This one arrived very early this morning." The paper was heavy, the seal impressed in dark wax. I recognized the crest before she even spoke. "The Hawthorne family," Charlotte said quietly. My stomach tightened. Viscount Hawthorne was an old acquaintance of my father's. Their estates bordered one another several miles north of Ashcroft. I had met the Viscount perhaps twice in my life, though I remembered his voice well enough. Confident, practical, the sort of man who understood alliances better than affection. Charlotte did not open the letter. That task belonged to the family. But the knowledge of its presence already seemed to settle into the room like a shadow. "Shall I bring it to your father?" "Yes." Her fingers hesitated briefly on the edge of the desk. "Eleanor." The way she said my name stopped me before I turned. "Yes?" Her expression had grown thoughtful. Not frightened, but attentive in a deeper way. "There are moments," she said slowly, "when a life begins to turn without asking permission." The words settled between us. I did not answer, because somewhere inside me, I felt the truth of them already beginning. Breakfast that morning unfolded with a familiar choreography of silver and porcelain. My father opened the letter. My mother listened. I tried very hard to keep my expression calm. "The Viscount writes regarding his youngest son," father said eventually. "Youngest son." The phrase landed quietly. "A good boy," father continued. "A little reserved, perhaps, but well regarded." Mother nodded. "How old?" 19. I lowered my eyes to my teacup. 19. The arithmetic of society was always precise. Young enough to be guided. Old enough to marry. The conversation continued calmly around the table. Visitations. Introductions. The possibility of an extended stay at Ashcroft in the coming weeks. I answered when spoken to. Smiled politely. Passed the bread. All the while feeling Charlotte's presence somewhere behind me near the sideboard. Silent. Watching. The world had begun to move again. And this time, it was moving toward us. That afternoon I went to the garden before Charlotte could ask. The iron gate creaked open as it always did. Inside, the roses had begun to bloom more fully since the rain. Pale petals scattered along the old stone path. The dry fountain held a thin pool of clear water where the sky reflected faintly. This place still felt untouched by the life beyond its walls. I sat on the bench. For the first time since Charlotte arrived, I allowed the fear to come fully into focus. The life waiting outside Ashcroft Manor. The marriage my family believed inevitable. The quiet understanding that women like Charlotte and me were not meant to exist inside the same story. Footsteps approached. I did not turn. Charlotte's presence had become something my body recognized before my mind did. She sat beside me. Close. Not touching. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said quietly, "Your father received a letter." "Yes." "You know what it means?" "I do." The wind moved through the climbing roses. Petals drifted across the path. "I wondered," Charlotte continued gently, "if you might wish to avoid me today." I let out a small breath. "I thought about it, and yet here you are." "Yes." She looked down at her hands. "You should be angry with me." The suggestion startled me. For what? For stepping into a life that already had a direction. I turned toward her then. Charlotte's face was calm, but her eyes carried something heavier. Responsibility. You did not step into it, I said softly. You revealed it. The words surprised even me. But once spoken, they felt undeniable. Charlotte looked up slowly. Our eyes met. The moment stretched between us. You think I revealed something? She asked. Yes, what? I hesitated, then answered with a truth I had not fully understood until that moment. Myself. Silence settled around us again. But it was not the fragile silence of uncertainty. It was something steadier. Charlotte reached for my hand. Not carefully this time. Not cautiously. Just simply. Our fingers intertwined. You know, she said after a while, that this cannot remain hidden forever. I looked toward the old stone wall where roses climbed freely in tangled patterns. For most of my life I had believed love would arrive politely. Approved. Expected. Something that fit neatly inside the life chosen for me. Instead it had found me in a forgotten garden. In the quiet space between two women who had never been meant to meet this way. And somehow, that more honest than everything else waiting beyond those walls. I cannot promise what the world will demand, I said slowly. But I know what it feels like. Charlotte's thumb brushed across my knuckles. And what does it feel like? I looked at her. Really looked. The woman who had stepped quietly into Ashcroft Manor and changed the shape of my life without raising her voice. It feels, I said softly, like something I will never be able to pretend I did not feel. The sun had begun to lower beyond the walls. Light spilled across the garden in warm gold. Charlotte leaned closer. Not urgently. Not desperately. Just with the quiet certainty of someone who had stopped pretending distance could protect either of us. Our foreheads touched. Our breaths mingled. And in that moment, I understood something I had not known before. Love does not always arrive in the life prepared for it. Sometimes it grows in secret places. Sometimes it survives only because two people decide it is worth the risk of being seen. Charlotte whispered my name once more. Eleanor. The future remained uncertain. The world outside Ashcroft Manor would still ask its questions. And somewhere beyond the fields, a young man named Arthur Pembroke was already preparing to meet the girl everyone believed I would become. But inside the garden something else had already taken root. Something quiet. Something stubborn. Something that would not disappear simply because the world preferred it to. I rested my head lightly against Charlotte's shoulder. For a long time we remained that way, listening to the wind, watching the roses move slowly along the old stone walls, feeling the fragile shape of a future we had not yet dared to name. Because love like ours did not begin with certainty. It began with a question. Surely it must feel like something. Now I knew. It felt like truth. And truth, once discovered, does not easily return to silence. Some stories grow quietly, like roses behind forgotten gates. And sometimes the bravest thing we can do is open the gate and step inside. So, I wonder, if you found a place like that, hidden from the world, but honest in a way nothing else had ever been, would you have walked away? Or would you have stayed, and let your life change with it? And before this garden falls silent again, I want to thank the first 1,000 souls who found their way here. Your presence has allowed stories like this one to bloom. If this story stayed with you, if even a single moment felt real, then perhaps you will remain a little longer inside this secret garden. Because somewhere in the quiet spaces between ordinary lives, there are still stories waiting to be discovered. And I would be honored if you return to hear them.